My project aims to protect the heritage of a rapidly changing environment, and that is by hybridizing conservation and tourism as a means of reassessing the Egyptian heritage, especially in the Nile Delta. Of course, the rise in sea levels is something that is very worrying, and we do not know whether we have reached the point of no return or not. So if we look at the northern coast of Egypt, Alexandria and the Delta, they are some of the most endangered places, most of the 10 endangered places in the world. And there are around 40 million people living in the Delta. Most of the produce in Egypt comes from that area. And this picture shows how the Delta residents are very connected to the land, whether because of the local products, the local produce, the monuments, etc. So we see here that there are expectations that the sea level is going to continue to rise, and the solutions available cannot give us a full resolution of the problem. And this picture is from Alexandria, and it shows the level of the crisis. So we need to understand the problems that are going to ensue and how we can deal with these problems in a better way. The project works on the preservation of hundreds of locations where monuments exist in the Nile Delta. And one of the issues is that the rising sea level could lead to the inundation of some areas. This is from the Abu Mina or Saint Mina, a Christian monastery, and even though it falls under the auspices of the Ministry of Monuments, it does not receive enough attention because it is not one of the well-known places in Egypt. If we look here at the endangered areas or the areas at risk in the Delta, we will find that there are many cities at risk. As to a rise of only 1 meter of sea level, this is going to affect millions of people. And if it rises by 2 to 3 meters, then we will find that there are places that are going to be inundated, and we don't know if we will be able to preserve these places or not. So a decision needs to be made. With regard to the rising sea level, yes, that is a problem. But however, the mismanagement of the Nile is another problem, because it could lead to the inundation of monuments. And I show you a picture from the 60s, because in the 60s we built the high dam, which led to the formation of the Nasser Lake, and it led to the submersion of some temples. And this led to one of the biggest projects in monument conservation in the world, and that was actually the start of the UNESCO World Heritage Association, and that was a result of the Nasser Lake forming behind the high dam. Some of the most important temples that were moved was the Abu Simbel Temple, and as you can see, this was a gigantic project. The whole temple was unassembled or disassembled, and it was cut into thousands of pieces. And you couldn't see the temple when it was broken into all these pieces, and now you can see how it was reassembled. The move of that temple led to new opportunities for tourism, of education, of methods for preservation. When we want to start preserving the heritage of the Delta, we need to work on the re-evaluation of the monuments available, where can we move them to, and what this can lead to. There is, of course, a financial problem, because the ministries or the government do not really give enough attention to the monuments in the Delta. So my project aims to mix between conservation and excavation in the Delta before it is too late. before it is submerged under the sea. The first location that I chose to work in fit the bill, not only because it will be at risk when the sea level rises, but also because it has historical value. This is Tell al-Dab'a area, and this area is inhabited by about 600 people living in 100 houses. And this place used to be a capital of the pharaohs. It used to be called Avaris, so we could use this location in order to attract tourism. And there are several scientists scientists in archaeology. They came from Austria and from other areas. They came to excavate in the area of Tell al-Dab'a, and there are still many areas that have not been excavated yet. So Tell al-Dab'a, as many places in the delta, it falls on a hill. So that Tell in Arabic means a small hill. And this is the location I'm going to be working on. So this is the context of my project. The pictures are not really that sharp. I apologize. So the idea is to start excavating in a scientific way. I think one of the restrictions I'm going to meet is that it is not allowed to dig and build foundations in that area, since it is a monumental area. So we cannot really dig for foundations in that place, and that gave me a different idea of a touristic and educational project, which is to build without foundations and to have temporary exhibitions so that we can use this area and we can move the structures from one hill to the other. So we can allocate the spaces, we can make them into social spaces, into educational spaces, and the important thing first is to know the dimensions. So normally the excavation starts in an area of 8 by 8 meters, and it is important to be able to move the structures that we are going to be building, and we will move it from one place to the other. We also need to have a conservation center there, so that we can preserve whatever we excavate, and what is excavated can be then exhibited. Because, of course, the preservation location or area is going to be bigger than these rooms that I have talked about, and the soil that we are going to get as a result of the excavation, that is going to be the starting point for the building, for the restoration center. So the longer the time and the larger the income that we get from the hotel that we intend to build and from the restoration center, we are going to be able to create employment for the residents of the area, and it is also going to help us with expanding the scope of our work. There is something that I discovered when I visited the area, is that after we fill the holes that we dug, if there is water that gathered in these holes, then we can expect that plants can be grown in these areas. So this means that we can have some income from the produce that we can plant in this location. This is also going to give a bit more sustainability for the project. And if there are any walls in these holes that we have dug, they can disintegrate into the soil. This is a picture of the location standing on top of the hill, and as you can see, there is some greenery there. This is the result of areas that were dug up before. So this shows that there is life after the digging and after the project ends. I'm also trying to understand the space for the restoration centers and how we can place the monuments in there. This was just an example from Tel El Dab'a or El Dab'a Hill, but there are other hills, and you can see here the sizes of the monuments that could be excavated from these areas or these relics. You can see the sizes in centimeters, and this is an area 30 kilometers north of Tel El Dab'a, so it has items there that vary in size. So in a nutshell, the project aims to look at how we can excavate as much as possible from an area whose dimensions are not exactly clear to us. And we need to understand the size, the age of the hill, and try to use it in a strategic manner in order to create learning opportunities, in order to excavate the monuments, exhibit them elsewhere. And this could help the economy of the country, maybe even in a small way. Thank you.
طبعا هو عمرها
The lifetime is limited, and what will happen after we've used these areas is still not clear, but it could be that it is going to be inundated or submerged under the sea. As we know, there is going to be a lot of displacement of the population in the delta southwards. So after it is used in that project, it is at risk of being inundated. Microphone? I didn't hear the speaker. There are two phases of this project. There are the temporary structures, and that is going to be the touristic rooms, like caravans, for instance. So these are caravans that we are going to be building. And I'm going to continue in English.
So the temporary will be the rooms where it's targeted for conservationists, archaeologists, and also for tourism. And after the full extraction of the excavations and everything, and that would give the potential to move these mobile structures into the next tel, basically. The permanent structure at the moment, which perhaps I'm still trying to resolve, is how the conservation center after extractions can spatially become an exhibit. And then, as I mentioned before, is that the plants or the shrubbery that would come out as a result of like the post backfill would then create public spaces and sort of an entrance hall as well for the exhibit center. If this answers your question.
What has been your conversation with archaeologists or with other experts that have done this before? I mean, this is an issue of concern, obviously, for the Delta, for the archaeologists, for the cultural heritage, even for UNESCO. So is there anything wrong in the plans that they have in place? Are you following their like kind of like constraints and forms of action? Like how your proposal is different from that, what in a certain way is to happen or is already happening?
From a point of view of the state, is that there's a very high level of secrecy, even going to my site. There's a very high level of secrecy and restriction when it comes to accessing the tell and trying to extract different methods of documentation. Currently, or in previous examples, the entities that would go there and excavate are international entities and not local. And this is why the proposal tries to kind of change the fact or reverse this idea of secrecy and not being able to document there as a local, and kind of decentralizing or decolonizing even the profession of Egyptology, like the study of the country itself, and kind of giving more agency to the locals in the village or the site, but also educational purposes on a local level.
Yeah, I have a few points I want to ask about the purpose that is, like you mentioned in the text itself, that it is beyond the object and artifact, and how this would relate to tourism, because yeah, me as also Egyptian, we really like tend to focus on artifacts, ancient artifacts from a touristic point of view, but how the purpose towards saving heritage or saving the memory that goes beyond the object itself. And that goes to my second question of which you wrote, relationship between heritage, locals and public, how this could be included within the process of process of the project itself, not post-project.
Okay, can you repeat the first part of the question again?
Is how to go beyond the object and to go beyond the centralization of tourism, the purpose.
Okay. I mean, the purpose also for the touristic experience itself is that we know currently in the countries that the idea of tourism is to actually look at the object complete and as it is. Whereas I'm trying to, like, as you said, the purpose of it would be to prolong this idea of the touristic experience and seeing the piece or the artifact, whatever size it is, from the point of extraction, and that's beyond this is beyond the finished point. And to the final point of completion and restoration. So rather than visiting it for, I don't know, a few minutes, is that I would prolong that experience for, I don't know how long the excavation is, which is usually 4 months, 5 months, like an archaeological season, basically. Yeah.
And how it feedbacks with the local communities in the process. So
the tell usually is landlocked basically by the village and agricultural lands, and so this is an opportunity for the locals to come in and man and operate the project, whether it's the conservation center or whether it's even helping to construct the mobile structures and managing the concept of the hotel. I'm trying to move away from the notion of hotel, but so far it is what it is right now. And yeah, I lost my train of thought, sorry.
I mean, just adding to this very last point, I think, I don't know, the idea of tourism as something good is something that I think we all are becoming very wary, right? The idea of tourism as a kind of a mass consumption of a certain idea of to-do lists or experiences to have, no, or things to consume. And what I like about your project is that you are trying to understand this as something that is a kind of an act of labor, no? It's a kind of you go for holidays, you go to a hotel, but in fact you go to a work camp, and that you go to participate in the if you want, savaging of a particular cultural heritage site. And you could say that in fact there are no funds. I mean, I think you need to make your argument a bit more robust in saying if it is not a hotel and if it is a camp or if it is an archaeological school for an entire new generation, or is a kind of a new mix or hybrid between a school and a hotel experience, in which it's not that you pay for your room or you pay for your fee, is that you pay for preserving a place, right? So how does one engage with these ideas of philanthropy and donations and experiences and learning into a new conglomerate that might be able to respond to this site and also many other sites? And how that experience is not just framed through the idea of tourism and like the service industry. I become very nervous when I hear that the locals are going to be servicing, no, and the tourists, and so because probably they have been, even if they have not had access. No, I think it's very important also to connect with the local culture, but just in terms of understanding the limits, the drivers, financial, political, and I know that you have them in your head. It would be nice to draw them beyond those kind of diagrams, and to find something that somehow questions a bit the idea of tourism as a good thing, and the idea of the economic development that it brings as a good thing. And I think in your case, it is, right? And for that, I think you need to invent a new term. And this is not because we're in the jury in translation. I always ask this. It's like, find something that might be able to resonate with the local culture or with the works and labors or the different activities that this architecture, that this camp, that this hotel wants to do.
I agree. I just want to build on kind of highlighting who the user groups are. And when it comes from the point of the locals, it's not just operating the hotel, but it's also they bring in kind of a local expertise as well that a lot of people that would come to excavate don't know about. So they know the land more than any other foreign entity or local for that fact. And for the idea of tourism, and this is why I mentioned before in the presentation, is that I'm trying to kind of reverse the notion of last chance tourism being bad, because globally it is a bad phenomenon, because last chance tourism, whether it's for Venice or any part of the Caribbean that's prone to subsidence, is that it's actually created more demand. And so more carbon emissions are being produced, flying there and so on. So on a global scale, it's bad. But what's good about the TEL is that it gives me spatial precedence as well, knowing that it's something that's landlocked and I need to use a certain percentage and a very limited percentage for the rooms. And then another percentage for the kind of the spatial allocation of the conservation center, exhibit center, and so on. So yeah. Sure.
مش سؤال هو بس I completely agree with you, and يعني بس عشان أزيد على اللي حكيت.
But I want to add to what you said that sometimes if you are using tourism in itself, you can fall into a conflict between the interests of those working on archaeology and those working in the tourism sector. So there could be a conflict of interest there between these two groups. So maybe your project is not exactly tourism oriented, because the tourism could have an impact or a negative impact on the excavation. This is something I'm working on now, clarifying the financial side of things and also clarifying that it is not exactly a tourism project, but it is an educational project that we are going to be taking from one hill or tell to the other. I want to quickly touch upon the relationship between the monuments in its context. So when you talked about Abu Simbel, you said that maybe there was no other resort but moving the temple elsewhere, and you were talking about trying to create an event around that last chance to see this place. So in a way, we are prolonging the life of the monuments in this area, but then what will happen to that area afterwards? That's what I want to ask. So when the project ends, what is going to happen? The tell is important, and it's because it has these monuments. But once you move the monuments, what will happen? This is something that I talked about at the start. At the moment, there is no work done by the government or the ministries in this context. They still do not understand fully what is going to happen due to the rise in sea level, not only in Alexandria, but elsewhere, because Alexandria is a large city, it's a well-known city, but there are small towns and villages that do not have the funds or the knowledge or the understanding of what is going to happen. So there are people who are moving to reclaiming the desert, and these are people who understand what is going to happen, and they are a bit outside the context of these villages. I think your project is good because you are trying to create a full system. You are going beyond architecture or the architectural design and form. You are trying to present a comprehensive solution. Thank you.
بدل الدولة.
I think we have to move on to the next presentation.
Cool.
Thank you. Thank you.
المشروع والاقتراح يسهم باختراع سكن اجتماعي
The
مستوحي.
goal is to create a housing block that's based on interactions. This is an aspect that has always been neglected in housing in Cuba throughout the many colonization, but it's a fundamental aspect of the daily life of the contemporary Cubans who spend a lot of their time in the streets where they meet and hold their interactions. Cuba has been colonized numerous times by states that have distinct ideologies, and those states imposed different styles of life on the Cubans. The most drastic shift was the creation of Soviet-style housing blocks. The communist state prioritized the number of houses rather than the quality of space. This has resulted in an isolation in the houses in terms of first the location. Those houses were built away from amenities and other cities. Second, these houses have created isolation in the sense of the relationship between the house and the outside
entities. ثالثاً
Third, there is isolation from your neighbors. The communal spaces are only the pathways you have, and also that those houses were purely functional. The most recent buildings in Havana, Vieja, attest to my argument, where the state is trying to make those houses more open to the outside. Cubans throughout history have changed the imposed typology via changing their houses and using the streets as spaces to aggregate and have dialogues. I have chosen Havana Central. It is a municipality that is highly populated. At the same time, it is the most marginalized in comparison with the two nearby municipalities. These are Plaza de la Revolución and Havana Vieja. The infrastructure in central Havana is 450 years old, and at the moment it's filled with many empty plots. This has consequences on the way of life and the flow of interaction between people. This is an image that shows the same street from two point of views or from two angles, and the difference is because of the empty plots. In order to create this proposal, I focused on a number of rules. First, that there's a natural flow towards the proposal with no main thresholds, that there are curved pathways that give more temporality to the space, making those spaces that people can meet in, that there are different sized common areas with different functions, that there are spaces that are split between indoors and outdoors. that there is a number of floors to match the surroundings and the local environments, that there are different types of balconies that depend on the local environment and the surroundings, that there are different types of staircases that will impose different styles of interactions. I also wanted to give some privacy to the inhabitants. Although they are extroverted and like interactions, privacy is still important to them, and they don't like others to be able to expect what is behind their doors.
Interact with people and that are very extroverted, but when you start asking them about their personal life, it's very private.
This is the proposal on the site, where I highlighted 4 aspects. First of all, that the frontality of the building is different to the interior. And this is in order to increase the level of privacy. Second, blurring the roads in the middle of the proposal in order
to avoid having these roads stop these interactions within the block. ثالثاً تحقيق أقصى وأكثر.
Third, to maximize interactions, and last is to build on top of existing buildings, so that, according to the proposal is proposing to have new buildings that are on top of previously existing buildings. In this way, if a building is demolished, it's easy to erect a building in its place. The shapes that I used in my proposal are based on typologies that I created, where I tried to maximize meeting points between the population or the inhabitants, and in order to create bigger communal connections between the inhabitants.
From both horizontal manner and vertical manner, and trying to see how I can make this work within the proposal. And that's it.
What is the system of ownership that you're proposing?
I didn't, in terms of owning the housing, the problem there is the housing is mostly owned by the government, and what they have there is, instead of selling, they house swap, and so this is an element that I have to bring into it now. So what I'm trying to do is fill in these empty plots that are already there and try to create different types of housing that would be more interesting for the people to swap with the existing ones. So, but in terms of really looking at ownership, I haven't.
I mean, I'm asking that because there is such an incredible opportunity to really rethink the idea of typology in relationship to idea of ownership, right? And what you just articulated, the idea that in fact permuta, no, that is the term that they use for these swapping houses, is one that always goes in relationship. Like there is one specific space in La Habana in which you go on to find the papers, because they don't have it online, to find out the permutas. And one is like a house with views to the sea. The other one is like house with a tree, house with a garden, house with a long corridor, house without corridors. Like the way in which Cubans are able to somehow scrutinize their homes to try to swap them, to find qualities, and the qualities that they are searching for me is probably one of the most incredible moments in which I started to look into architecture from a very different set of eyes. And I think that is a real opportunity for the development of your typologies, that if you go back maybe 3 slides when we have the plans, when I look at these typologies, I understand the idea of centrality. I still see the functions of like cooking, eating, separation of functions, and somehow how you arrived here to me is still unknown or very fast, and I don't know what is the drivers, right? If it is because I saw in the booklet that you were focusing on the idea of permuta, or if you are looking to the idea of like structural stability. And I mean, one of the big problems that Cuba has is access to material construction primary sources. And so I'm trying to understand how we got here and what was the driver, if you could talk a bit more about that.
So initially, like the way the unit started focused more on the formal expression of the block. And so initially I just looked at it from a formal point of view and very intuitively. So I didn't really have a driver at the beginning. Then once I started looking into Cuban culture and visiting and being there, I really noticed the importance of these interactions. And so this was the driver in order to create these typologies which enhance the interactions not within the block, but also within the house. So this is what drove me to create that. But I think, yeah, like now looking at it, I'd have to like develop it more maybe and see how I can look at it from a point of view of the permuta and seeing what I'm giving and like more to the people and what I could create.
I mean, just to add into that, I would love even the idea that sometimes you would start in one extreme of the block and you would swap, no? You would make permuta even within your own site as you grow older or as you like become with more family or less. Like, what are the if this was like Rosalind Krauss, the expanded field, no? Like what is the diagram that actually sets these as a kind of an experiment in itself? Because as you said, you started in a formal exercise, and as such, I think that formal exercise gives you a lot of freedom to test things. And so even the idea that you have like handicap accessibility versus non-handicap accessibility. One of the big problems is the population aging in Havana and not having architectures that can support them. So I think that there is very interesting experiment that you can do within this square that you have set for yourself. If you really go into detail, and the permutation is not just a formal one, but one that looks into ideas of ownership or value, accessibility and age, and so on.
Okay, so the project is really interesting, especially as we're speaking about this parallel between different cultures. What really struck me at the beginning is the fact that people expand what you mentioned in the brief, that the house expand toward the interior courtyard and try to use the street as public space. For me, this is very interesting because in Damascus, for example, the old city of Damascus, the courtyard houses are the main typology over there, and people expand appropriate space from the street. So we end up like with very narrow streets, and to kind of like preserve this private interior courtyard, and then you end up like with some dead-ended streets. So it's very interesting to see how different cultures or how architecture differs not only in language but also in the way that we interact with the space around us. What I also wanted to add is like something about the irregularity in the kind of typology that you're creating. From what I see, people in Havana, they don't want any kind of like typology or system or space to be imposed on them. They want to be active in how they shape the spaces around them. And I see like that on your own, you kind of manage to reach different typology. It's not like one solution that's standardized and copied and paste. But what would be more interesting is to create a kind of like system, not final typologies, maybe a system with rules or like parts, and try to think how people would interact together or how people would be active in shaping the space based on these typologies or rules that you're creating. I don't know. Want to add anything?
And what you're saying is very relevant because they had a movement in which the people helped the government build, so it would add a layer to them.
ممكن بس كمان بس تكملة مش تكملة يعني بس
I'd like to add, what's the relationship between this project with the surrounding area? I think I understood you said some of those empty plots used to be buildings, but those empty plots are still surrounded by state-owned buildings. So what's the relationship between those two areas? It's all a residential area, and the plots or the buildings that have been demolished were not demolished on purpose, but the infrastructure was very old, 450 years ago, was built 450 years ago, so it got demolished because of the poor infrastructure. When I showed you this image, this is
looking at the other side of the streets. So since there are already these interactions on the street of my side, and they are blocked because of these interactions, my proposal will help make this, like, enrich these interactions and make them flow better throughout the whole area.
اوكي بس ما بتحسي انه في
But don't you feel that there might be differences because you will end up having new houses that follow a certain style, unlike the previous one? I'm not saying new houses will be bad, but I'm just saying will be different. You mean difference in terms of what people want, or difference in terms of styles? In terms of styles, but also in terms of how people interact with their spaces. If you have two plots very close to each other, and you have people who deal with the public space as their own labyrinth, as their own space, and right next to them they will have more traditional, if this is the right word, because I don't know much about the Cuban context. I would just say that you will have these two contexts juxtaposed, new ones versus traditional ones, with different ways of interacting with public space. You could also, and this feeds to what Reem said, you could try and link this to the context you already have. So maybe the new buildings will have access to the other buildings that already exist. How could you add to what's already there? I just talked to my tutors, and one idea that came up is to
some of the spaces in order to start to introduce the site. So expanding the existing ones, giving them more spaces to interact, to open up, to have more space, and also in a way, having more housing. So looking into more into detail as to what I could do with the existing as well.
Interesting.
It's just wonder. أنا الحتة الهندسية عندي في مجال تاني خالص فأنا مع
I come from a completely different engineering point of view, but
wonder actually everyone. كذا مرة you said like to give, to give them, and sometimes I feel it's a standpoint موجود عند الانجينير of to give a service, yeah. But how, as a researcher first, to absorb and to live and to take in order to design. أنت مغطية aesthetic, مغطية design, but how to get from their opinion. It doesn't have to be literal, but sometimes I can compose to form an aesthetic and to form a design from my own point of view, and I see, okay, I'm giving them a garden. I'm giving them bigger space. That should be good. Who am I to say that? And it's just to wonder من ناحية الاركيتكت قدام فين.
أنا إنه الطريقة اللي اتعاملت فيها هي وقت كانت هونيك كان عملنا كتير interviews مع.
When we were there, we held many interviews with the locals and we listened to their opinions.
Compared to Havana Vieja و Plaza de la Revolución اللي عندهم أكتر public spaces, public park, places where they really can be there. إنه كانت كتير أكتر إنه they needed these spaces. They felt like they were lacking these spaces. Also in the quality of the housing, since this site has been disregarded as in comparison to the other ones. And what they were saying is the like having better housing. So these are the two elements that I was trying to do and produce in the proposal.
The point that the point that you make is a very important one that has to do with what we ask, and I ask everyone at the beginning of the year, like, who has the right to speak on behalf of who, and what steps do we make in order to actually take that authority? And as architects and also as a school, sometimes you do what we call partial exercises. You go to a site to get inspired about a series of conflicts, historical, material, social, and at some point you abandon that burden that is extremely difficult to address, and then you engage with historical typological aspects of housing, and then at some point later on you try to reconcile those two things if possible, because to have a linear process of like understanding the site, the complexity, and then being able to make a good ethnographic or anthropological research, and then finding the cause and the action, as much as we won't imagine that that's the right, sometimes it's difficult. But I think your point is essential. Every single project that I see in Cuba, and I was one of the students many years ago who did her project in Cuba, I cannot see it but a total disrespect and a kind of colonial attempt of trying to impose relentlessly something that has absolutely nothing to do with a highly complex condition in which one lives. And so the question is, how does one do that? And how does one do it differently? And I think you owe it to yourself, beyond the images, and to tell us that you were there, to explain the sources of architectural form in relationship to very specific drivers that have to do with the history and its context today as well. I'm going to ask. Thank you.
Okay. The permanent transient spaces هقدم بالإنجليزي بس.
Permanent transient spaces, I'm going to be presenting in English, but in the middle there's going to be a poem in Arabic, and then I will continue in English.
طيب. In 2016, the Netherlands began a program where they repurposed empty prisons as holding places. This is an image of Muhammad, a Syrian refugee in his cell in Dikopal prison. What I like about the image is the way in which he reappropriated the space by compartmentalizing it and allocating different functions for each corner. This is a way for him to gain control over his physical environment. He dissolves the walls of this prison cell through placing these sentiments and objects on the walls as a strategy that gives the individual his power back. So my project's intervention, is it playing? It's not playing. Okay. So my project's intervention focuses on the limbo period after fleeing a country and before resettlement. I've been working with Somali women, and this is one of the one-to-one holding places that was occupied, being reconstructed out of fabric. Through dissolving its walls, we expose its interior onto the city. ما هو المكان الدائم العابر؟ مكان إيواء أو حجز.
Then, what is a permanent transient space? It is a holding place. What does it hold? What does it contain? A soul in limbo, a soul balancing on the line of time with strings attached to what was, what is, and what will be. It holds interwoven stories, creating a tapestry of a trapped identity. How do we intervene within the walls that define a space, that muffle the choir of lost voices, lift the veil of this space within the nun's place where no place is our space?
So there are different types of holding places. There are emergency shelters, transitional shelters, durable shelters, all designed for minimum living standards and repurposed existing buildings. For example, this used to be a 2-bedroom apartment, is now a space that has 9 people occupying it. Ooh. Okay. The brief I gave myself is, in the context of Somali women on their journeys to Europe, how do we create a platform in these transient spaces to archive what the walls hold, their memories as the objects they carry with them, in order to expose what is being held, a holding to account. A holding to account to whom? So, in the context of Bibi Abdullah, previously known as Muna, an asylum seeker I interviewed who's currently in a holding place in Germany, the power system to hold to account is the Yurdak system. So, if it's not clear on this stage, these two drawings are both timelines of her journey, a journey through space, and a journey through experience. I did that. The Somali Civil War began in 1991. Bibi left Somalia in 1995 with her husband. She left her children with her mother because of expenses and so that they can continue their education. She fled by ship to Yemen, then was smuggled to Saudi. From there, she went to Syria, but at that point, she was sent back to Somalia. However, she was determined. She went back to Saudi, and after multiple applications, her tourist visa was finally accepted to Italy. From Italy, she went to Denmark, then Sweden, staying in different types of holding places in each destination, which she describes as feeling like she was in prison. From there, she went to Norway, where she stayed at a relative's house, and their asylum applications were successful. So she saw that as a sign of hope. She went to the police, applied. However, since then, her applications have been held. So she tried again in Germany. However, the main issue with this Eurodac system is it states that the country that takes your biometrics, your fingerprints, is the country that's responsible for you. So she's in Germany right now. Germany doesn't know what to do with her application. The police officers are withholding her application, so she's just in this limbo period, waiting, and she's still being moved in Germany from one holding place to the next. So it's been 25 years in total since she left Somalia, and she's still being moved from one holding place to the next. There isn't an image on the screen for this, but I then compared her timeline with 5 other Somali women from the same context and background, but the difference is that they were resettled. But I found that the similarities of this limbo period before settlement was very similar in terms of experiences that they've had. So the first part of the design strategy of the proposal is done through making and collaborating with individuals living in these holding places. So I traced Muna's community in the longest holding place that she was in. The longest holding place she was in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and it was also the first point I came in contact with Muna 22 years ago. And I held a workshop with her community 2 weeks ago. So I invited 7 people, however, only 2 showed up. So the goal of the workshop, I split the workshop into 3 days. The first day was the spatial memory. I asked them about their spatial memories of the past. The goal of the workshop was to sort of collect stories. The second day, I asked them about the spatial conditions of their present. And the third day, I asked them about their spatial visions of their future. The second part of the design strategy is reconstructing the past for the present through storytelling, through the stories they're telling me. So from this workshop, this blue thread was on the table. It was a trigger to a memory for Rahma, one of the participants of the workshop, where her mother used to use this blue thread to sew tablecloths. How do you play this? Oh. So, yes. So this led to the visual reconstruction of her past family home from her memories through listening to her stories. There's supposed to be... أحياناً تطردني وتقولي اطلع برا ما بدي تقعد جنبها اتفرج وخلاص انه حاولت اني اتعلم
كنت أجمع الجيران أولاد الصغير عيال الصغير أرسمها بعدين خلاص انسحب وتركته جيت بالمقدشة وبعدين كمان الرسمة يعني كتير تغيرت يعني مو زي أول بعدين صرت أشتغل يعني للحنة.
So from the stories, what I just said is I basically reconstructed her past family home with her through talking with her as she told me her stories. This is the plan of her past family home. Her aunt's room where she learned henna, which is what she was talking about in the video, and how she makes a living today. Her mother's room where she learned how to sew, also something she continues to do today. Her grandmother's garden, which she used to admire, and it's something that she carried with her. In this plan shows the current holding place she's in, and what's happening in her current situation is all these objects and activities from the past have sort of woven their way into the present holding space. So leading to the final stage of the design strategy, archiving the past in the present for the future. So the video I'm about to show are the paths and collections of holding places of the people I've interviewed with the objects of memories from their past. So the design is a digital object that is in time built up, like it's a built up archive of the past and what is carried into the present. And the idea is that it's for the future. Yes. It's a communication tool for individuals living in these spaces to create and use, where connections are made and the feeling of belonging is empowered. It's a communication tool also for the other, exposing this archive of memories on hold for second and third generation migrants that are oblivious to what their parents and grandparents have been through. That's like myself, however, I'm from a different context. The other also being the governments and power systems, like the Eurodac system perpetuated by the European Union that has placed officers as their pawns, perpetuating these limbo periods like withholding documents. Also, the collapse of the Somali government that occurred led to the formation of clan systems that has destructed the historic archives in Mogadishu. In Rahma and Salam's case, the Saudi government that prevents them from bringing their families into the country. The US Army for intervening in 2002, claiming the land as this refuge for Al-Qaeda. The IMF and World Bank for introducing capitalism into the 80s after they gained their independence from their colonizers, and the list goes on. So I've only began starting to think about this design process this week. And what I'm struggling with in this is this friction between the physical and the virtual, where in the virtual you lose this poetics of the space that a physical archive, a one-to-one archive may provide, where what the physical loses that the virtual has is this question of designing for the future. There's more of a permanence that comes with archiving physical objects virtually. Thanks.
ممكن أسألك بالعربي؟
Okay. أكيد.
Can I ask in Arabic? I'm not sure if I understood you exactly. I understand your project, but I'm not sure if what you are trying to do is to create a virtual archive. And do you show your subjects the result that you've reached? I have just finished that work, so I haven't had the chance to show them the result yet. But what I did is that when I created these memories, I built it together with the subject, and I was showing it to her so that she can correct me if there is anything wrong. But in terms of the archive itself,
work with it work on it with them. لأنه I don't think I should يعني completely take control of the design at all. And it's you know, the idea is for it to be a collaborative making of this archive.
اوكي والاركايف بعد ايش بعدها بصير يعني لمين الاركايف لإلهم
And for whom is this archive? Is it for them, for you? The archive is for them so that they can have a platform through which they can see their memories.
There's this idea in that if you keep the archive, you somehow keep it connected. It's virtual. There's this permanence to the virtual part of the archive. That would then be used for and seen by second and third generation migrants. فهو like time is a bit difficult because there are people on this journey now and they haven't had their kids yet and they are going to have their kids and their kids are going to be born in other places. And then there are people that have already gone through their journey and they are already settled and their kids are oblivious to what actually is going on. The idea, you know, it's for the future for these kids, but there are people that could use it today that aren't going through these. Not use it, but look at it. Look at the archive.
سوري بس عشان اكون
Yes, it's okay.
بس بشكل عام هو انت عم تعملي ديزاين للهولدنج سبيسز ولا كمان الماضي تاعهم ببيوتهم او ولا خصوصا بالهولدنج سبيسز اللي كانوا
Are you designing the holding space or are you designing what happened in their previous living circumstances?
It's not. A design would be the tool to use. So what's being reconstructed in هدول الفيديو اللي you just saw. These are as they are, the holding spaces as they are exactly بالسنتي إنه كلهم. But what's just being added in no, I'm just putting them all into one space and just adding on to their memories within these holding spaces virtually.
اوكي فانت عم تبدي من
So you are starting out with the holding space. I am building their past family homes.
من هدول past family homes. بس بعدين عم باخذ هدول memories وعم بحطهم present holding spaces.
I'm taking these spaces in the past and putting them in the present. Are there any objects that you haven't added yet? Well, there are many people who do not have objects, so when they flee, they leave everything behind.
زي قبل previous video that I showed. These memories are, you know, how she spoke about where she learned, you know, the space she learned how to do the henna, and the space she learned how to sew. And it's about recreating these spaces that they're holding on to. There are moments where they have objects like pictures, objects like specific tie-dye like scarves that they hold on to. But what's more important for them, I think, is the memories that they left behind that I want to reconstruct.
الهدف من العملية هو إعادة
And the idea is to redesign the holding space or to design something for the future, or are you documenting?
Memories. لأنه aesthetically بالvirtual proposal, I want to then dissolve the walls. You know, they're not the important part of the. And yes, I'm putting them in the present space where they're remembering, but I would like to dissolve these walls because they are not what's important to them. And it goes back to this first image that I showed, where of Muhammad in his cell, where he has these memories and his objects on the walls of the cell, and it's sort of kind of playing with that idea and trying to recreate this differently.
هاي الصورة كتير مهمة وشيء.
I think this is a very important picture, and personally, I can relate to this. because I am a Palestinian refugee. I lived in Syria and then I had to leave Syria. But however, I was luckier because I did not have to live in a refugee camp or in a detention center or in a holding space. Personally, I tried to substitute the place with some objects, like a blanket, for instance, or a basket. It may not be functional, but it was for me something that reflected some memories. And I tried to carry these things with me from Istanbul to Egypt, back to Istanbul, so I can totally relate. And I think that this is a very important project. This is how we can recreate the space in order for it to have a particular meaning because of the absence of the space that witnessed our memories. So for Syrian refugees in Istanbul at the moment, there is Al Fatah area which has transformed. It now looks more like an area from old Damascus. So the documentation part of it is important, and I don't know how this project can develop in the future. I think it could be moving from documenting to creating something in reality. It is very interesting that the memories and the history is being put into space. Whether it's a holding space or a virtual design, this holds memories. And you also talked about other issues that you need to think about, which is the time, the history. So if the purpose is to keep this memory or the information for coming generations, maybe we need to think more about this. Because there is always a starting point. But of course, there is history preceding this, and there are events that come after that. So maybe this is something that you need to consider. So in addition to an archive, are there intangible or non-virtual things that you want to deal with, like memories, for instance? So maybe you need to think of how you can develop this further. Maybe you can connect this with the current living conditions, how they are adapting. Is there something you want to add? Hi, Jomana.
Thanks for sharing. I'm going to speak in English because I've never done this in Arabic, so I'm sure it's going to be a struggle. I should try. Have we run out of time? That's fine. Okay, I'll be really quick. I think for me, it's very beautiful what you're trying to do. But for me, I think the question really is like, what is the purpose of the archive, and how are you using this to critique a particular system that's in place, or to critique the state of migration, to critique, like what is it? You can. It's fine, I think, that you are proposing an archive, and in whatever form it may take. I don't have for me, it doesn't really bother me whatever it may be. But for me, I'm kind of more interested in you said a lot of things, like you stated a lot of facts and a lot of problematic issues with migration, and I'm just kind of curious, like, how do you position yourself? And what is it that your project is trying to say? And I suppose it can do that through the archive, in whatever form that may be.
Right.
So
it's maybe I said it in passing, but the idea is that this archive is used by them and constructed by them, but it's a holding to account to. The problem is that each individual has had, even though the actual experience is different, but the cause of the migration for each individual varies. So the holding account to who changes depending on the person. So in Bibi's case, the holding to account would be the Eurodac system. to that system that I'm critiquing. In Salam and Rahma's case, it would be the Saudi government. But ultimately, the response is also, because I also said this in passing, which wasn't that good, was that the archives in Mogadishu have been destroyed by the clans. So there is sort of this urgency to continue to record something as it's happening, as history is going, record it. But yeah, I should think about that more and be a little bit more specific with who, and like a bit more general, and then going back a bit more specifically.
It's also about history.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite.
I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the project could kind of the project could kind of be what you are proposing or what you're designing could in a way kind of put forward a problem and ask people to kind of and provoke people to kind of engage with it, you know? Or it could also be propositional in the way that you're kind of saying, this is the problem, this is how I think we can resolve it. So I guess for me, it's not entirely clear where you sit at the moment.
Right.
And, you know.
Yeah, okay.
I guess it wasn't really kind of like, I want you to answer the question. It was more kind of just have a think about it and see where you want the project to kind of sit.
Right.
Because I think it's very important what you're doing, and I understand, like, you know, the value of the archive. Okay, I'm going to stop talking because I'm probably going to repeat myself now.
I will try to put it in a way that I don't have a question. I know that you are in a process, and in this process you will explore more. It's just me listening to you gave me a perspective that I want to share. I really love that you, I think because you used recording, and I come from the world of sound, and so it made me to listen to you from a sonic perspective. And I really loved how you entered into their sonic memory and you grabbed the intangible of their sonic memory and to create space out of the sonic memory. So this is a translation, which is a topic of today, and to translate from a sensory to a space, that's amazing. I love this, how to say, like a process. Through this process, there is critical political areas that it could be confusing, and what to conserve into an archive and what to document, and or what to unarchive and what to release. So for me, I see like amazing soundscape as an architect, form of architect, and this is maybe this perspective could transcend into sensorial more than the political narrative of a memory. Okay. If that makes sense. But good.
I agree. I mean, it's what I'm struggling with, trying to figure out which direction I want to go in. It's like, should I go into this very dry, like, political, this is what I'm stand, or should I go into like more of using the sound of their memories and going back to this sort of performative aspect? There's a bit of friction that I need to pick a direction.
I just a quick one. Can I recommend you have a look at Colette Dalal's piece called The Dreamer? She's an actress. And she works with, like, she creates entire kind of plays around memory, time. Like, it's really, really complex, and it's always her, and she is constantly playing 4 or 5 different characters, trying to reconstruct different kind of moments within her life history. I think you would really enjoy her work, and I think it could be really.
Okay, The Dreamer.
Yeah, come look. Let's have a chat afterwards. Okay. I can give you the details of how to find it.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
As like a final comment, just because I was thinking of it, because of the context of today, I think it would be good to, building on Khalid's point about sonic memories, I think thinking about the role of language in contributing to our sense of belonging when we're far from the place where we came from, or what role can language play in your archive to make people feel like that they're home, because home doesn't have to be a place, it can just be a sense of being.
Right.
So I think it could be interesting to play with language in the same way that you've been playing with objects, and to use certain sounds to activate your archive, maybe in different ways.
Okay.
That could be just another thing to think about.
Okay.
Thanks, Joanna.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi. I'm going to be presenting my thesis, actually, a bit different, but okay. Lebanon,
Lebanon, my name is Rawan. Lebanon, 3 religions and 18 political sects. Lebanon is one of the smallest nations in the world, one that's not even visible on every map. However, the diversity and conflict it has been significant to many nations around the world. From the first generation of the humans occupying Lebanon, which dates back to 47,000 years ago, Lebanon has morphed drastically through many colonies and phases of control, whilst simultaneously morphing through many political, religious and cultural phases. This modern-day Republic of Lebanon and its political instability is thus a result of its complex past, standing in the way of any political and national reform. Lebanon's political instability is mirrored through the nation's infrastructural instability, as everything in Lebanon seems to be needing fixing, from politicians to regulations to electricity. So what is Lebanon? And most importantly, what does it mean to be Lebanese? Lebanon as a nation was geographically established following the Treaty of Versailles under the French rule, gaining its geographic borders in an attempt to separate the coastal Christian population from the Muslims in the Arab Peninsula. However, the accuracy of this geographic division was inefficient, as there were large populations of Muslims and Druze in the coastal Lebanese territory. These populations of people who have coexisted and existed for centuries have finally gained their freedom from their colonizers, resulting in a post-colonial condition of instability, fear of oppression, and fear of the loss of their identity. Each religious sect wanted to control the nation, fearing a radical change in Lebanese cultural practice could result in a loss of their national identity.
Not be taken for granted. فتعريف نفسنا مع بلد مش قادر تعرف عن حالها مسألة كتير كبيرة. بعد ما فشل العصر العثماني وبعد ما لبنان أخذت استقلالها من فرنسا.
Lebanon as a nation was geographically established following the Treaty of Versailles and following the demands of the Ottoman Empire and Lebanon's independence from the French. The identity of Lebanon was up for debate. Does Lebanon identify as Arab, considering the language spoken was Arabic, or does Lebanon go back to its identity as Phoenician? This debate in itself is at the heart of the Lebanese identity crisis, as identifying as Arab has a larger implication, particularly relating to the Islamic religion, considering that the Quran is transcribed in Arabic. However, how can a nation's identity reflect a singular religion when the sole reason its geographic borders were established was to separate the Christian population on the coast from the Muslim population in land? And thus, is the current Lebanese identity crisis a religious debate, or is it a political condition? Lebanon was and continues to be a land hosting 18 political sects. These sects, however, could not agree on appointing control to single person, as being biased or sectarian was never an option. Being sectarian could not protect both views on whether to become Arab or stay purely Lebanese. Thus, the Taif Agreement basically assigned each position in the ministry or parliament to a person from a designated religious sect. This indirectly constitutionalized the idea of appointing each religious sect a political leader, allowing religion to manifest itself as politics. This allowed the Lebanese to perceive religion and politics as as interchangeable as notions of identity, where a political leader was believed to protect the cultural, religious, and political view of what they believed their homeland should compass: Lebanese, independent, or Arab neo-colonially. Thus, Lebanon, again, 3 main religions, 18 political sects, and 18 notions of nationalism.
فالحكومة السياسية شكلت السياسة.
The government of confessions, the confessionalism government, becomes the structure that the political stability of Lebanon relies on. And this structure itself is the structure that has allowed for the establishment of 18 notions of nationalism, the structure that has allowed for the political instability. For one, dividing positions in parliament based on religion and not on professional skills literally defines the current structure of the nation, where who you are or what you believe in comes above what you can do. Additionally, the integrity of the current political leaders is questionable, as these are the same leaders that committed war crimes during the Lebanese civil war. Thus, these leaders saw that they got away with it before and continued down the same path, thriving over the divided nationalist sentiment through acts of corruption. Amongst the many forms of corruption in the nation that I cannot start to tell this, tax evasion, tax theft, tax violence, etc. And following the crisis of extinguishing some of the fires that took over the country and the failure of the fire brigade to put down those fires, the people started to wonder, where is our tax money going if the basic fire brigade is underfunded? This has resulted in all people turning their backs on politicians, while in the past they used to see those politicians as the symbol of the nation from a very sectarian point of view. In Lebanon now, people from the south to the north are united in their opposition to politicians, and if somebody dies in the south, they hold funerals in the north. Lebanon is no longer 18 different notions of nationalism. This new revolution has opened the country, has opened the different groups in the country to each other, and has made one new notion of nationalism. My project looks into the role of revolution that has united the country from electricity. Now, electricity on a national level is used at really high levels. If we look at Lebanese usage of electricity, we see that it's high compared to the reason. Whether it's due to political instability and a need for surveillance, or if it's due to a cultural practice, the nation's demand for electricity is undeniable. Now, Lebanon could produce 200 megawatts, while the national demand is 3,000. Sorry, it can produce 2,000, while the national demand is 3,500. And this has led to a system of rationing where electricity could go off from 3 to 14 hours. This rationing is hard to adapt to, as electricity in Lebanon is also a monopoly, limiting the generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity. To compensate for this, motor generators started being used to subsidize the needs for electricity. However, as generators produce a lot of electricity, it became a business to provide electricity to buildings during rationing hours. Thus, this new grey market was formed, now known as the motor generator mafia. However, where multiple mafias coexist, they have to agree which streets they control. One mafia cannot distribute electricity to a street that belongs to another mafia. This is an example of a form of violence, an act of violence, where one mafia was showing another mafia to not trespass on their territory and to not sell electricity where the original mafia works. And also, you are being charged by a unified rate, not based on what you use. It has become a monopoly. You are obliged to either buy from the mafia controlling your neighborhood, or you may not approach anybody else and you are without electricity. This is one manifestation of corruption in the state. And when there was one fire, when the fire reached the electricity pole, people celebrated as if they were bringing down the establishment, the corruption.
Okay.
When this post, when the fire reached the electricity pole, people celebrated again as if they have toppled down the regime. EDL, the Electricity Department of Lebanon, is a monopoly, and the company is instantly associated with being an authoritative power, and it's heavily influenced by many political parties. On top of what we produce, we have to import electricity from Syria and also the 2 Turkish power ships. Alongside the internal politics that stand in the way of reform, like the generator mafia greasing the hands of politicians to send back a Turkish power ship, where there are external political powers playing as well. For one, the political interferences with the gas pipeline from Egypt. But before that, this one power ship that was coming from Turkey has asked to return because of political influences. Also, there is political interference at an international level when it comes to what I've mentioned, the gas pipeline from Egypt. Currently, Lebanon imports fuel from Kuwait and Algeria, and diesel is quite expensive. Thus, the electricity department and the nation subsidizes the cost of diesel because the price of electricity has not changed since 1996, but the price of diesel continues to increase. A third of the national debt in Lebanon is due to this subsidy, because the state is afraid to increase the price of electricity, so they increase the price of diesel. On top of that, politicians and state also interfere in the plan of production by the electricity department. This all means one thing, that we need an alternative solution. Currently, the 18 political sects have ties with external countries like the US, France, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iran, and Russia. This means that foreign powers are fighting their proxy wars in Lebanon, playing another role in the interference for any kind of reform. Thus, all unified infrastructures in Lebanon begin to resemble authorities, and the instabilities seen within them unravel. My plan is the following, is to first establish a technocrat government made of polity of experts whose religious and political affiliations need to be kept at discretion at all times. Second is to get off the grid figuratively, allowing for Lebanon to break ties and reliance on all foreign nations fighting proxy wars in Lebanon. This will mean that Lebanon will not be relying on different sources of electricity. 3, getting off the grid literally. This means Lebanon electricity generation, transmission, and distribution will be all controlled by Lebanon. This means that we will find a local source of energy and halt the import of diesels. 4th is to establish a judicial system that holds all the politicians accountable for their corruption. This system will hold accountable all of those who have committed offenses and they have to go to prison. Or an alternative is to go to a 5-star prison. This money that the politicians will pay will be then the nation getting back its stolen funds from the politicians themselves. 5 is to formalize a new market for the establishment of public services. These public services, like transportation, electricity, etc., will help Lebanon to be on the international map once again. I want to talk from an architecture point of view. I was looking at electricity from 3 levels, at the regional level, national level, and the consumer level. My project will combine political instability and the electricity grid to propose an infrastructure that can stabilize the situation in Lebanon, helping establish a physical relationship between the people and the nation, and establish a relationship between the people and the economy. The project is currently looking at inverting the structure of these 3 existing scales, allowing for the generation of electricity to be localized, using the nation as a backup and the region as an economy for excess generation. This could be achieved via 5 steps. First one is minimize the demand for electricity. Second is diversify the energy sources. 3 is to reorganize the energy distribution systems. 4 is to introduce a new energy storage. And 5 is to generate a new economy. The key intent is to reorganize the architecture of the national infrastructure, enabling new policies and new relationships to take control where the political ones have failed. Unifying structures in a post-colonial state have proven inefficient, as even the nationalist sentiment has been segregated. Through the Lebanese Revolution, however, and a unified nationalism, establishing a unified polity with a singular aim can be established by generating an effective polity of experts who can work together in establishing firm roots in the nation that cannot and should not be moved regardless to political interference.
Does anybody want to start?
You can start if you want.
Okay. Okay. There's one thing that kind of struck me is you spoke a lot about the kind of electricity mafia, and then you spoke a lot about different zones having different allowance for consumption at different times of the day. And I was kind of really disappointed that I didn't see any like spatial analysis of that. So I would have liked to see like how that applies, and also understanding how that fits in with the kind of demographic, social, God, what's the word? Well, how Lebanon is actually divided based on religious and sub-religious kind of areas, territories. And so I would have liked to see kind of how that compares to the consumption of electricity, and to also like the motor mafias.
The interesting thing about that is that the consumption of electricity is based on a kind of economic, it's based on an economic condition. So like Beirut, for example, gets 3 hours of rationing compared to the Ba'a, which gets 14 hours. And Beirut, because it's the main city, they consider it as a city that needs more electricity, when in reality, people living in Beirut have a higher income than people living in Ba'a, who suffer more with the loss of electricity, and paying for motor generators is more expensive than electricity anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's like that. It's in more of an economic perspective than it is of the divisions of how electricity is divided, than it is of a territorial, religious kind of thing. But I did actually look into that, and I think I should definitely try to map that out.
Yeah.
There's a, you know the artist Marwan Rishmawi? I don't know if you know him, but he basically has a sculpture, or like a piece sculpture. It's actually, I think, at the Tate now. It's in their collection. Rishmawi. And basically he has a work called Beirut Caoutchouc, which is like a tar map of Beirut on the ground. I mean, like a large scale one. And it shows, and it's almost like a puzzle, and it shows all the different neighborhoods and all the different factions. I mean, you can't, he doesn't write the factions out, but you can actually see how divided Beirut itself is. Yani that's alone all of Lebanon. But anyway, I think this could be, I mean, at least visually, an interesting reference. لأنه it's a physical work on the ground. But yeah, anyway.
مثل ما قال جورج هو interesting mapping project.
George said it's an interesting mapping project. It's important maybe to see this, like how we are understanding the revolution in Lebanon now, that it is a revolution against all the politicians, regardless of what sect these politicians come from. Because at the end of the day, people have been able to recognize that there is a certain layer of politicians, a certain group of politicians that have been abusing their powers regardless of where they come from. It's more of a class struggle maybe rather than a sectarian issue. So I don't know if you work on such a map, what would you find out? Is the distribution of electricity based, or is the rationing of electricity based on what sects control what regions, or would you find out that it's a certain class that has access to the resources or to the available electricity? Also, what is the relationship between the formal electricity supply from the state and the informal electricity supply from these mafias? It would be interesting to see how these two types of electricity supply interact on the ground. And also in Lebanon, there's a new element. The Syrians, the Palestinians have been there for some time now, and the Iraqis, but the Syrians are a new factor. There's almost 1 million Syrians now living in Lebanon. This is a new factor to take into account.
Palestinian refugees, they're more distributed within the nation. They're more they've already coexisted within the nation. لأنه the issue in Palestine is almost at the same time that the Lebanon gained its independence from France. So they've been in Lebanon as long as Lebanon has been Lebanon. But they still live in these informal camps, informal settlements, and they still use these informal connections to get electricity anyway. So that's why my project, by flipping the structure and localizing the idea of localizing generation of electricity through مثلا solar panels or hydroelectric as a had nahar, the people would be able to create a relationship with the land to kind of solidify their presence in the land, no longer stealing, but actually generating electricity, becoming a part of this land, stabilizing their homes, stabilizing their dwellings, and all these things. Yeah, I think you're completely right to the idea. But the Syrians kind of بعدهم contained in the north, but the Palestinians have the camps are integrated within cities. يعني there are cities like Saida, for example, that has 2 or 3 different camps within the city. And then Beirut, there's already 2 camps as well. I totally agree.
No, I think there's kind of like some in the kind of the way you build up the premise to your project and to your proposal, that at the moment maybe is lacking a little bit of or touching on issues like Syrian refugees, which is a huge issue that's discussed in Lebanon and which takes a huge toll on the infrastructure. Yeah, and I think you need to acknowledge that, and you need to kind of make a point of that. I think there's the other thing, which is kind of a spatial analysis of all of these things you're talking about, because at the moment it's almost kind of like you're giving a presentation to the UN, but actually I would like to see some spatial understanding of how this works, because all of the information you're telling us is so juicy, but would be so much more juicy if it were represented. Yeah,
100%. And my studio project, I'll definitely go more into it.
Of course. Sorry, you said this was your thesis, right?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. This is your HTS.
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. It's all it's constructive for my studio project anyway.
God, no, I completely missed that. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, but
and then the other thing I wanted to mention is you mentioned the post-colonial condition, but actually I think you can delve into that much deeper and talk about the colonial project and the existence of Lebanon as a safe haven, for the Christians in the region, and then what that actually means today, and how that affects the way that we at a much higher level, the way that our infrastructure and structures are set up.
I'll just say one quick thing about that, because I agree with you. The electricity company is called Électricité du Liban.
Yeah.
As just a very simple, which I completely agree with you. This is
I don't know, هو أنا مين عشان أقول اللي أنا هقوله.
I don't know what entitles me to say what I'm about to say, but I will just say it regardless. And I just want to highlight that I am representing myself. I'm going to be straightforward. And I believe maybe others who might be closer to your topic might even have a similar story. I am the son of the Egyptian revolution. I lived the Egyptian revolution. I was at the front lines. I was active the whole time.
الستيت اللي أنت فيه.
So I relate to the state you are in regards to what's happening in Lebanon. What I want to say is between this idealism and what we have in reality, between these two, there's practice. And this is what we need to focus on, practice.
أنا مش قادر أقرأ. أنا شايف.
I cannot get what is your precise project. I can see your motif, I can see the fire, and it is really beautiful to have all the emotion and fire to have. It is very clear, the purpose, the will, the fire. However, maybe you need to try and to narrow down, to focus on what it is that you want to work on. this would be my feedback. This would be what I can contribute with, because I feel I've been where you are right now, and I understand. I can relate that sometimes we are enthusiastic. The political scene is making us very excited, but however, it could make us blind. Unfortunately, I have to say sometimes we're blinded by the political optimism, and I believe many of us in here may be able to relate to that.
ما بعرف إذا بدك تروحي بهذا الاتجاه.
I don't know if this is one thing you want to work on or not, but the revolution in Lebanon has a spatial aspect. And what I mean by that is people are re-owning their city. I don't know a lot about Beirut, but based on what I can see on Twitter, people are going to old theaters, reopening old theaters. The squares have been reoccupied by people. It's more populated now. You see people everywhere because people have reclaimed their areas. Yes, they have reclaimed their squares. That's true.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I missed the beginning of yours, so I should have said something that you were presenting your thesis. But I think what's interesting is how, as a written piece of work, it relates to something you're interested in your design work. So I didn't know whether just to end, you wanted to talk about the relationship between the thesis and maybe what you're doing in the unit?
I think my thesis kind of, as you were saying, brings out the fire of the project. It brings out like the history and the juice of it all. But I think when I'm getting more technical now with the studio project, it's very delicate because I'm working with like the laws, the constitution, the electricity law, to see all the loopholes where the project can sit precisely in this point. You know, like how much. So I'm looking at localized generation, how much we can generate before we break a law, where the connections are, all these little things that I think make a big issue. But I'm currently kind of, my project in studios looking at 3 different types of cities: the big city, which is Beirut, a medium-sized city, and then a mountain city, to see how localized generation can come in, to understand how from the building, how we can store energy for the time of rationing and all these things. But I feel like the thesis itself helps me understand the premise behind it all, like why we got to where we got to.
No, just because I think, obviously, you submitted your thesis a few months ago, and continuing to work on the design project, it could be interesting now to think about how the two come together, how one contextualizes it and the other kind of spatializes it, which is what George was saying. Mm-hmm. But I think also, to bring it back to the topic of today, which is language, I think it's interesting to think about the agency of the architect to work within these different types of language. So one being the kind of the language of politics and history, and the other being the language of the law. So where do you, finding the loopholes is like what you do in finding like the gaps in how a law has been written, as well as the language that we have as architects to draw and spatialize things. And so at which point do you deploy which of these tools and how do they come together is something I think you could think about.
That's really interesting, because like what you're looking at, like even at a policy level, is something that we have Lebanon as a state has adopted from, you know, its French mandate actually. So I think there is a lot more research that needs to be done in understanding how the colonial structures influence and affect the state of the nation today. Yeah, that's it.
Sorry, just last thing. But يعني just from what Manager said and also George, ممكن برضو يكون interesting إنه to factor in طبعا دائما الواحد بتمنى إنه الأشياء.
Of course, you always hope that things would have happened better or happen better, but maybe because we're talking about Lebanon and there's this colonial history, and Lebanon has always been a safe refuge for people to go to, it might be interesting to take in or factor in this state of emergency that Lebanon always seems to find itself trapped in. So what happens in those repeated states of emergency? What happens to the infrastructure? When people go, for example, reclaim this square, what happens to the infrastructure?
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
مساء الخير، اسمي خالد البشير وأنا طالب.
Good evening, my name is Khaled Al-Bashir. I am a 4th year student in Diploma 19, and my research is looking at performance in architecture, and it is focusing on Birmingham. It is the second city here in the UK, and it is undergoing a lot of transformations and investments. The name of my project is Places of Ideas and Ideas to Places. However, I decided to refer to it in Arabic as the static and the dynamic, as I am inspired by Adonis the poet. I would like to present to you some of the references that I came across when I was doing my research. And these references, some of them are Arabic references. And maybe this will allow me to present the project in a different manner. I am looking at the role of the architectural language, especially the pictures. I wanted to start with Abu Hayyan Al Tawhidi, and he is a thinker and a writer from the Abbasid period. And he is one of the controversial personalities. People can think the world of him, and people can think that he is good for nothing. And some have accused him of infidelity, and some considered him a religious authority. An example of what he wrote is that what I found is that whoever creates something is never really happy with what they have created. So this is one of the possibilities. Another possibility is that we can never really achieve perfection or completion. And another option, of course, is that the person, the human being, is the creator. And what I wanted to know is, can architecture be interpreted in different manners? Or is it something that is fixed and cast in stone? And just to let you know, at the end of his life, Al Tawhidi burned his books because he did not think that they were good enough. So I'm now going to talk about the Kersen Street station, which is the twin of Euston Station in the context of the high-speed rail project. And it used to be a train station between London and Birmingham. However, it was shut down in the end of the 19th century, and then it was demolished, and this is what remained, which is that arch at the start or at the entrance, which was designed by the architect Philip Hardwick. And it reflects the arch that was at Euston, but was demolished at one point in time. And both arches were inspired by Hardwick's visit to Italy. And in the plans for the new station, I became curious about something. I became curious about the different representation between the two buildings, and I started to examine this, starting with the pillar. In Arabic, the word pillar is connected with the word that has the same root as the word mayor, which means the pillar of the society. And this is something that shows how important the pillar is. And even though it has a structural significance, it also has figurative significance. So if we look at the Pharaonic and the Persian pillars, then we will see that they had representations of stories of the deities, but the Greek or the ancient Greek pillars, they had different representations and different meanings, and these pillars were emulated and imitated in the Western architecture until the 19th century. The Islamic pillar has as its model the Roman pillar. It had different shapes and forms. And it was used also to have Quranic verses written on it. And I have here some examples in this picture from the Mamluk period in Cairo. However, the neo-classic pillar, it had two functions, or it carried together several functions. So it had an architectural function, but also it has a representative function. And after that, we find different forms and shapes of the pillar. So if you look here at the King of Koma in Japan, you will find that it has played a different role in this structure. When we look at the function of the pillar, if we take away that function, then we will find that it has taken a different function, which is like some sort of a representative one or an imagery kind of function. And this is also something that I wanted to look at it further in the static and the dynamic aspect of the book of Adonis. And this book says the following, that what is static is the kind of thought that is based on text and that it never changes, while the dynamic is also based on a text. However, it can be interpreted in different ways that makes the text possible to use in different, or relevant actually, in different contexts and different times. And I went on a trip to Rome and I started making some drawings, and through taking away the forms and the decorations and just focusing on the structure, I started imagining different formats and different shapes of these structures. And these are examples of what I did. I also started making pictures of the floors in Birmingham, and I started comparing the different floors or the different layers, placing them one on top of the other. I also reached this figure here. I had other architectural or structural experiments. And there are some structures that allowed me to take away all the ornamental parts or aspects and just focus on the crux of the matter. And I tried to put together different structures using colors. And this, for me, was helpful in order to understand what is the static and what is the dynamic. And based on trying to find the similarities between the places, I started to take pictures of the Kersen Street station, and I started to collect these pictures from the archives, and I started to place them on top of each other, and started to get singular aspects out of these pictures. I went to Birmingham and I started exhibiting what I drew, and I asked the public to try and put together pictures using the small elements that I gave them, and I was quite surprised at the result. And they created this piece of art, which they called the New Guerrilla Movement. And this is the story that we concluded with.
Collect all the flowers and wheat from the city in order to eat them.
But the voices were coming from the railway.
And they trotted between the farmyard columns.
At the moment, I am putting together a proposal for a train station, and I chose this for two reasons. First, because the requirements were very clear, and the question here: how can I use the differences of pictorial representation in such places, and also. I want to conclude by saying that the place through which to which our imagination goes can never be an apathetic or an indifferent place. It is a place where people lived and they did not live in it in a sort of objective way, but in a very subjective way. Thank you.
لسه عايز
Would you like to connect this still to the railways? I started looking at other methods. I started studying the railway stations and their dimensions in a different manner. So I want to know, is it possible to use this method? Is my question. So you are looking for the method, is the question. Yeah, so this was the language component. And of course, there was this conflict between the picture and the space. Could you tell us more about the language aspect, especially with Adonis and Nusayr? Well, I decided to skip Yassin Nusayr in this aspect. He talks about spatial criticism. And he asks, can we use different scales when it comes to the imaginative space? As to Adonis, he used figurative speech, and that is what I'm trying to do, to connect between the figurative and the literal. So he is saying that a poet does not own the text, does not own the poem. It is something that is the property of the reader. And there was this discussion between those with a classic kind of thinking and those with a more progressive kind of thinking in terms of interpreting texts. And what I'm trying to do is how can we use this in order to understand architectural methods. I want to ask then, what is the language in architecture? So, considering architecture as a language is something that started maybe in the 60s or the 70s. Christopher Alexander saw the classic architecture as a classic language. As to the more modern architecture, it was an interruption of this. And as to post-modernity, he used language to start bringing back that connection. So the architectural elements that he used were meant to continue that connection. So for you, what is the language element in architecture? For me, it is the difference between poetry and prose. So poetry uses figures of speech that allows the word to say much more. And architecture is the same. Through images, it can create this. There are elements in architecture that we can consider as grammar in a language. So the way that I connect between the different elements in architecture can be like grammar in a language that allows me to put different parts of speech together in order to create a sentence or to create a meaning. So the challenge for me starts with the design of the railway station. Do we start then with the pillar and the design of the pillar? Is it going to help us to achieve that poetic image, or is it going to kill it? You're thinking of Adonis or maybe Yasin Nusayr, but at the same time you are working on a railway station in Birmingham. So, well, to be honest, these references, had I not been presenting in Arabic, I wouldn't have used them. They are part of me, they are always in my mind, and I'm very influenced by the poetry of these people. But I also agree with you. Is it doable? Is it really possible to use such theories or such ideas in architecture? Well, I think it's very interesting because you are thinking in a different language. And you are thinking in this language in a space that is very foreign to this language. To be honest, I'm struggling with the language.
Saying and half I can't, because so I'm like half listening to the translator and half listening to you, because I'm like, I should be able to understand this. So I'm unable to give you some proper constructive criticism because I'm really struggling. And it's my problem because of the language. But I did want to say one thing is to the Birmingham comment is that actually I don't think it really matters where your site is in a way. Like it doesn't, whether it's in Birmingham or whether it's somewhere in Egypt or whatever. Like it's irrelevant what the context is. At least that's how I see it for the kind of exploration that you're doing. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say really.
أو برضو تخيل أو حاجة.
There is something that came to mind. When we look at the pharaonic civilization, it had 3 languages. The godly languages. So these were architecture, imaging, and also making statues. In Egyptology, we see this as the languages. So they had these 3 divine languages. And for me, I think that you created some sort of a feedback loop. You are closing the circle. Also, how you showed the picture in the pharaonic pillar. I don't know era or the period of this pillar, but I think it is from the early pharaonic period. So the language of the picture has transformed from being symbolic into a spoken language, you know, so the hieroglyphics, it moved from the images into being a spoken language. And the Phoenicians started spreading this in the Mediterranean. So there is this transformation that the picture started getting a sound connected to it. So there is this change that happened, or transformation that happened in 1500 BC, and that is the invention of an alphabet. So I think you have this somewhere. It's just an idea that came to mind. So not from listening to seeing, but from seeing to listening. That's what you're saying. What I'm saying is that the picture gets a sound. So from seeing to hearing. This was the first time that the letter is not based on a meaning, but the letter is based on a sound connected to it. And this was not the case before. So I very much like how you are talking about the static and the dynamic, how you are addressing the image and the relationship between this and the space. And I think then that you are closing the circle, starting with the ancient Egyptians and reaching until now.
السؤال الأخير يعني مع التجارب.
Last question, through these experiments of yours, through drawing, through modeling, what is the meaning that you got out of this experience compared to what the people who were part of this experience concluded? So when this is transformed into a project, do you think that it is going to mean something very different to the people who will see the end result, or do you think that there is going to be some sort of an intersection? I don't know if this answers your question. But one of the pictures in my presentation was inspired not only by Birmingham's history, but also the colonial history. And this is a project that started a long time ago, where the Orientalists, for instance, would start drawing pictures of the areas that they visited, so that colonial history is part of it. And when you start looking at interpreting what you see, if someone doesn't know the history, they may interpret it differently. So the new guerrilla movement is something that came from the public in Birmingham, the ones who interacted with this project. So you see the pictures and you understand the pictures through your own background. And at one point in time, to be honest, I felt that I was making up something that was not there. In your workshop or in your exhibition, did you feel that there were points of commonality among the people who attended this workshop, people who lived there? It is too soon to say this, but my impression from Birmingham is that there were points of commonality in terms of the memory, but then not necessarily in terms of identity. there is difference. There were people from London, there were people from Birmingham, so it was a bit difficult to find an identity that gathered everybody. And in the absence of this collective identity, can you create an imagination maybe that is wider in scope? These are just some observations.
I'm to say like how much I appreciated that you not just like translated your text to present, but also that you changed the title to reflect what you were going to talk about, and you brought in new references. And so I thought that was quite fascinating, and I'm quite curious to see how this influences the development of your project. Which I wouldn't be able to judge, but so thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. مرحبا. أنا اسمي فرح. I'm in Diploma 3.
I'm from Diploma 3, Forensic Architecture. Microphone, please. Microphone.
Makes difference. فرح. Yeah.
The brief this year focuses on the body politics based on the work of forensic architecture. Forensic architecture approaches sensing and analyzing architecture and the environment with a detailed, constructive, and investigative approach. The architectural model becomes a useful tool to investigate both the biopolitical and geopolitical. The environmental veins of Syria have been contaminated with the toxic remains of the warfare. Toxic remnants include bombing, shelling, chemical warfare, and airways that target the population, industrial facilities, and agricultural fields. This research seeks out to understand the toxic chemicals treated as interscalar vehicles that could guide one to unfold the consequences of war, from the atomic and microscopic to the urban, from short-term to long-term impact. Angiogram is an imaging test that identifies arteries through using a special dye that's injected into the human body. In relation, water is investigated as the arteries of the environment to help me identify drought and climate change that could have been a catalyst in the Syrian war. The Euphrates River flows through Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. Human intervention in the Euphrates River is highlighted through the abundant construction of dams between 1975 and 2010. The construction of the dams changed the morphology of Lake Assad over the years, and the calamity of drought and increasing population soon affected its waters. The top half of the timeline in front of you on the right identifies data and statistics for drought. The bottom half of the timeline highlights dams constructed between 1914 to 2010. And also it highlights the key environmental incidents in the war, such as targeting water and agricultural land after 2011. The rainfall trend line portrays a decrease from 1910 to 2010. However, there's also a steep decline between 2006 and 2010. The specific, if we look from 1938 to 2010, we also see a continuous decrease. Moreover, the data for water levels of the Assad Lake were only found from the years 2002 to 2015, and from the data retrieved, the water levels had decreased by 3 millimeters in 2010 and by 6 millimeters in 2015. Specific crops were also affected by the drought. Cotton, a heavily water-dependent crop that used to be fed using flood irrigation, which is an old and unsustainable technique, cotton had a major decline in 2006, and this decline continued until 2019. Soya bean, a summer crop that already suffers from lack of water due to dry seasons, declined in 2009 and continued to decline dramatically from 2011 and afterwards. Declines ranging from 2011 and 2019 could have been affected by war and displacement. After the Civil War, the timeline identifies the fluctuation of weapon use. Due to severe drought in 2006, reaching 2010, 2 to 3 million people were affected by agricultural failures by 2011. Around 800,000 people lost food support. Around 1 million people were displaced to camps or small cities that lay in the borders of major cities. Environmental concerns after the war are further analyzed. Using archived footage and satellite imagery, I try here to create a scene that analyzes the rapid violence within space through detecting weapons used and the scale of their impact on the environment. Analyzing the detonation of a 2,000 Libra aircraft bomb, the direct impact of the bomb has a 7-meter radius, whereas the blast pressure has a radius of 31 meters. Lethal fragmentation weapons can reach to 365-meter radius. Another investigation for mortars at 120 millimeters at a shooting range of 7 kilometers. This investigation estimates that the probability of hitting the actual target within 108 meters is 50%, and within 480 meters is 99%. The direct impact of the bomb has a 10% probability of reaching 100-meter radius, whereas at the shooting range of 2 kilometer probabilities of accuracy are higher. Another study for the 122 millimeter multi-barrel bomb rocket system holding 40 rockets at shooting range of 19 kilometers has a direct impact of 15-meter radius and a blast pressure impact of 40-meter radius. Inaccuracy in hitting the target is evident. It's around 54%. Inaccuracy is around 54%. This identifies or says that most weapons have a very large impact area. This means that toxins could spread across water bodies environment, causing contamination in a range of scales, from the scale of the disease, the scale of the individual, and the environmental scale. Interscalar vehicles are treated as objects that observe and experience traveling through time and scale to better understand the effects of violence. I have chosen toxic chemicals such as TNT from weapons and PAH from bombing crude oil. I'm treating these two as interscalar vehicles that guide one to understand contamination cycles from air, soil, water, and the human body. Burning and bombing oil refineries have severe negative impacts on the environment and the human health, releasing the toxic substance PAH. PAH are toxic substances and organic compounds that can be transported over a large area before deposition in soil by fire. Also, attacks on oil refineries and depots have the potential to generate significant air pollution, as well as local soil, surface water, and groundwater contaminations. Multiple oil refineries have been bombed, including the Hayyan oil refinery, Al Jafra, and Abu Hardan oil field. The formation of PAH from a gaseous phase into a solid phase causes respiratory diseases and liver cancer, which is a form of slow violence. However, the lack of data on the mobile properties of PAH, I decided to further investigate TNT, an energetic and toxic substance contained in weapons. A series of improvised weapons have been used that include barrel bombs, hell cannon, chemical rocket assisted munitions, which were built without a proper factory setting and waste management. Many children have been employed to make these weapons, exposing them to toxins. Furthermore, properly manufactured weapons such as rocket mortars, barrel bombs, and aircraft have been used extensively. Human exposure to these toxic substances may occur in a variety of ways, especially in highly populated cities and agricultural regions. Breathing in dust and particles, eating contaminated food through contaminated soil, and drinking contaminated water are ways of exposing oneself to the toxins. Toxins can lead to respiratory and skin diseases, as well as can cause cancer and other diseases. Moreover, not fully detonated bombs can result in leakage of explosives such as TNT and DNT, contaminating soil, surface water, and groundwater. Starting from urban areas and given the available data, this map shows the spread of weapon usage in the north of Syria. In blue, it's the water pathways and bodies. And then you could see those concentrated areas of using chemicals causing burns. This fast, you could see that explosives could have a continuous radius of effect. If we are at the scale of the millimeter, there is instant soil structure change, and this change makes it more porous for TNT to reach the groundwater. TNT can be rapidly absorbed, and after it reaches the surface water, TNT undergoes rapid photosynthesis to a number of degradation products. Its high water solubility causes instant contamination that leads to pink water. At the rate of slow violence and the scale of nanometers, TNT and its metabolism is taken up throughout the plant, and you find high concentrations in the roots. Concentrations of TNT and metabolism of the TNT in plant tissues generally increases the concentration in the growth medium. Once TNT reaches groundwater, it will persist for long periods of time. At the scale of the kilometer and nanometer, the volatilization half-life of TNT is 10,000 days, which is the estimate for ponds, streams, and lakes. In the context of slower violence, it's a human exposure to TNT through indigestion, through dermal contact of foods contaminated, through uptake of the compound from contaminated soils, and drinking contaminated water, or deposition of TNT particles from the atmosphere. Slow forms of violence at the scale of the millimeter and nanometer occur in the cells of the human bodies, in which TNT is transported via the veins to the lungs. We zoom into the different parts of the blood transportation system and the respiratory system. The TNT travels through the body to cause damage in liver and lungs. With the research provided that explains the ecosystem of toxic contamination of certain chemicals in the environment and their connection between scale and time from the disease to the human to the environment, I propose to do further research into sensors that detect toxic substances in the environment in order to design a system of sensors that can be implemented across multiple affected sites in Syria to detect and warn, and also to find a bio-remedy. Thank you.
Hi.
مرحبا.
I also had to put on the headphones. So, okay, so sorry, the last sentence was you're proposing sensors that detect and warn. So like a network of sensors.
Yeah.
I want to
Can you just repeat the last sentence?
I want to design like a system of sensors that can be used on Syria that not only are there to warn and detect types of chemicals in the environment, but also to be able to like biodegrade or bioremediate the soil, so that basically you can remove the toxicity from the environment.
Okay, I just need a minute to. If anybody else has a.
بس يعني انت بدك تصمميهم هم مش موجودين هلا.
You want to design such designs, they don't exist. Oh yes, they exist, yes, but
yeah.
فانت بدك تعملي زي.
So you want to map based on your research to know where those could be placed based on which areas have a lot of toxins in. Yes. I think a very big point here is the mapping itself and the damage scale, or the scale of the damage that have happened or have been happening at the level of the human being, at the level of the cities. And also, based on what I understood, you're talking about fast forms of violence and the slow forms of violence. That the scales you are measuring are different. They depend on the size of the damage inflicted on the environment or the human being. And also the scale, one of the scales is the timeline, that different kinds of damages are happening at different times. Maybe in the future, this would be an important point to see what effect or impact could these sensors have on how people interact with their environment, with their space. So maybe those sensors could change the way we interact with our space, with our city. So maybe if I see a red line, I don't go to this zone. What would be the dynamics of these sensors in such environments? Does it mean we are moving more closer to having smart cities? Like I'll be using my smartphone to see what areas are safe for me to go to? The way I look at it now is similar to what you just said, that we could have different sensors to sense different things. For example, contamination in water. Another sensor could warn you against contamination in the soil or contamination in the air. So you will have a different set of different sensors that will sense different levels of contaminations in different environments. And maybe something similar to what you said, a smart city. I'm not sure, however, that it would be a mobile phone that you will be using to tell you what to do or where to go. But maybe a smart city, I'm going to switch to English.
In specific areas around Syria, so it's not something temporary.
Can I ask? Okay, so I've got a few questions actually. So in a way, like the way that you presented your research is, I think, it comes across as really, really well kind of put together and very believable, right? Which I think is absolutely crucial to your project. And you're confirming something that has been hypothesized and proven several times, that there is the use of chemical weapons during the Syrian war by the Assad regime. So my question is, okay, so you're saying, so you're making the assumption that the war is going to continue and that there's going to be more continuous use of chemical weapons, and therefore you are going to need these sensors to detect or is there an assumption that
it's because like through my research drawing, I was also showing I was showing it through different scales and time.
Right.
So that's why I mentioned that like for example TNT, it would last 10,000 days
right.
in lakes or ponds or streams, whereas it would last around 119 days in rivers. So it really depends on the body that it was released onto. So like basically my research not only goes through different scales, but we try to understand that this chemical, so like you have the blast effect, which like immediately destroys buildings and so on, but then you have that kind of slow violence that just stays for long periods of time. So I'm not like assuming that the war would continue, but
Okay.
it's something like it's a form of slow violence.
So even like if the war finishes tomorrow, the effect of these
Yeah, the effect will
chemicals
go
are
on.
going to
Yeah.
be there for a while, and
Yeah.
we still need to deal with them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And who installs them?
Installs what? Sorry.
The sensors.
That's like this is my proposition for now, but I'm not like extremely sure about how I'm going to go about it. So like after I've done this research, like this is like the next step forward that I would want to take.
Because it's kind of interesting, like if there is a denial internally that there is the use of chemical weapons, and we continue, you know, as is for the next, I don't know, 20, 30 years or whatever, how do you, like the structures have not changed in order for you to be in a position where it is openly acknowledged that there is the use of chemical weapons, and in order to use these sensors, there needs to be an acknowledgement
By the Assad regime.
But
by the state.
It won't happen.
No, but that's what I mean. Like, I'm just interested. Like, this is. I guess my question earlier was more kind of like, what is the context in which these sensors are being used, and who is it that's?
I just have like a point to make. Like the chemicals I studied, they're not specifically from chemical weapons. So chemical weapons would include toxins such as like chlorine or serine that would suffocate a human being. Whereas like I chose like TNTs and explosive energetic material that's found in like a variety of weapons.
Right.
So it's not specific to just chemical weapons.
Okay. Yes.
يعني برضو على سؤال.
I wanted to complement George's question about access to the areas, especially when we consider that they are surrounded by bodies of water, correct?
وعادة
And areas that are surrounded by water usually have certain levels of security or are monitored. So I don't know what would access look like. Another issue is the people. How can we spread awareness amongst people on how to use those sensors? Especially if the areas we are dealing with are still unstable, people come and go in those areas. If this is the context you're working in, it will need a lot of work, so it is effective. This is true, but many people are now returning. They're going back to Syria.
They left, and this year around 2 million came back. So like, في استعداد.
So there's this willingness to go back to Syria. The problem is, and this is what I've been trying to say, many areas have been contaminated, and it's an issue we need to address. I feel like most of the questions raised here, or maybe most of my questions, will be in the post, what's going to happen afterwards. And you did not talk about this. You talked about the bit you focused on. There will be a stage or a phase when you want to produce those sensors or install those sensors or use them on the ground. Which is an issue you did not touch upon with what you presented. What you presented, however, is very good, is very precise. The topic is very focused on a specific issue. It is scientific, the approach is scientific. You talked about the human body, you talked about ecology. I have no question about what you have presented, and any question I may have would be how are you going to do this? What is the plan? What's the implementation plan? But well done.
Going to implement a system of sensors. Honestly, like I would like some feedback on that. If you guys have any feedback on that.
It's a form of like, activism. Like, as people come back, they get like secretly handed a sensor, to like, you know, to just like plonk somewhere in the ground, or is it like something that is just kind of distributed worldwide, so anyone that's, you know, going through Syria gets to put, I mean,
I think your question before was really important, because
your question before was important. Hopefully the war will end, but even when it ends, there will be
actually built on, I mean, a lot of the problems that were there before. Unfortunately, we've seen this in a lot of places. So I think this question of how to go about it, or how to, practically and logistically, and who is in charge, like who are the people who are implementing this or maintaining it, or ensuring that it doesn't happen again. So, after the 10,000 days.
Maybe like the logistics would be outside the scope of this project. Like, it would be like very hard maybe for her to answer this, but maybe what I still find interesting is like what are like who are these sensors reporting to? Yeah, like is it just like statistics and data stored somewhere, or there is like a feedback that like people in the city are actually seeing what kind of like data these sensors are collecting and acting or behaving accordingly. So this also has like more spatial aspect to it as well. So maybe this is something for me to think about. Yeah.
Okay.
My opinion in the implementation, don't go top bottom, go bottom top. Create a model, create a model of this environment, the whole environment. Try that. This is the implementation to create the model and promote it to institutions, promote it to people who would relate to, associations that would be interested to go there. This is my opinion. It's this direction. Promote it, fundraise it after creating the model. And I see that's a route of, and be aware it's long term.
Sorry?
It's a long term.
Yeah.
Actually, this bottom-up like implementation makes lots of sense. Like activating the grassroots to be part of the process. So maybe if you kind of not only design where these sensors can be located, but also kind of try to design a system of behaviors. So like if we start with 10 sensors and like we place them here and here and they're like by people, putting them in places, I don't know like what's the start point exactly, but based on the feedback that we have from certain sensors, we know that we need to go more this direction. So the system can grow gradually, if this is what you mean by the bottom up as well?
Yeah, is to what I mean as a first step is to go there and to make a test in a certain area or a certain and to film it, to have recordings, to have data related with scientific data, with all that you will the materials and the data that you will fetch from.
When you say go there, you mean to the actual site?
To the actual site, or to recreate the site. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not saying to make a bomb or to no. I'm not saying that. I mean the chemical compositions.
I was just gonna say like me going to Syria and testing it out, like that.
You have
that wouldn't be an option, no.
Yeah, this is why I was like trying to say like to create a model by how to simulate, exactly, to simulate it with data, simulate it with the contained environment, with chemical, to approach also chemistry experts. I don't know.
But I think for me at least, I find another approach, that there's another approach to this, is actually like more about like the cultural shift and like the propaganda involved in like, I think this can very much be like a propaganda kind of machine, you know, like what is this thing doing in the current context of the Syrian political structures, you know, like how do you introduce something like this when it is, you know, how much of it is denied from within the system as an issue that needs to be dealt with, you know? So in a way, like there is that kind of that kind of part of the project, I guess you could take the project in that direction and evolve it as a kind of systematic proposition, as opposed to trying to figure out exactly how this thing works, because
it's like banging your head to the wall, you know. It's like we know the systems and we know the regimes and we know, like, just do the action.
But it's speculation, no? I mean, I don't know. Do you have...
بس أنا بفكر إذا يعني إذا أنت عم تحكي إنه يعني.
Are you saying you want to take this idea to the people in charge? What are you saying in particular? I'll be speaking in English.
Of the situation is that not much has changed in the existing kind of political structures. There is a dismantling of parts of it, but ultimately the people at the top are still there, and there is there's a propaganda that is associated with them, and that is still kind of very much driven or driving a lot of the way the things that they do. And so I mean, I'm more kind of interested like how you subvert that using this system, like how do you that's why I was like, is it a form of activism? Like, is this a kind of another form of a revolution where it's more kind of environmental, like people are trying to start I mean, I don't know what this thing looks like or how it works, but like, do you just start poking this sensor everywhere? And then how do you do that if it's going to be from a grassroots kind of movement on a huge scale, how do you trick people into doing that? I don't know. I mean, it might not make any sense, but I'm just kind of like, this is kind of my interest.
It's interesting how you're saying like it can be a different type of revolution.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. Like I have like, I'm half Syrian, and like my most of my family lives in, or all of them live in Beirut now, my Syrian part of the family, and like a lot of them are still very much like, they believe that everything that comes out of the political system, in Syria, like there's a very, very amazingly strong propaganda kind of agenda that is still infiltrating society at large. And so I wonder how you subvert that, or like, yeah, that's how I would kind of take it forward, I guess.